It was one of those mornings when the lake looked like glass, a perfect mirror of the sky. I had my coffee on the dock, listening to the soft hum of the aerator pump that kept the water fresh and clear. The lake wasn't huge, about 1.5 acres, but it was mine. My property line cut clean through the cattails, the no trespassing signs visible from every angle. I'd built my cabin here for peace, away from the suburb chaos and, more importantly, away from people who thought shared amenities was an excuse to invade. Which, as fate would have it, is exactly what my neighbor Karen believed. The HOA president, self-appointed guardian of community harmony, and the undisputed queen of other people's business. I noticed the first signs of trouble around noon that day. Voices echoed across the lake, laughter, splashing, and the unmistakable sound of cheap Bluetooth speakers blaring pop music. At first, I thought some kids had wandered off from the community side of the road. But when I saw a line of cars parked near Karen's house, coolers being rolled down the slope, and people walking confidently onto my dock with towels slung over their shoulders, I realized the madness wasn't accidental. Karen had apparently decided that my lake was open for public recreation. I walked down with the quiet fury of someone trying to avoid committing an actual crime. A group of strangers was swimming near my floating platform, shouting and taking selfies. One guy had climbed onto my kayak. Another woman was tossing bread at ducks like she was at a petting zoo. And then there was Karen, in her wide-brimmed hat and oversized sunglasses, sipping something sparkly from a plastic flute. "Afternoon," I said as evenly as I could. She looked over like I was the intruder. "Oh, hi there," she said with that tone that's equal parts condescension and fake sweetness. "We're just having a little neighborhood get-together. You don't mind, do you?" "Actually, I do. This lake is on my property." She smiled wider, the kind of smile you could hang a lawsuit on. "Oh, that's adorable. The HOA map shows this as shared recreational space. You really should attend meetings." I'd been to exactly one HOA meeting, long enough to learn that shared space meant anything Karen decided she could reach without walking too far in heels. I pulled out my phone and opened the county GIS map. The boundaries were crystal clear. "See that?" I said, showing her the screen. "That line? Everything from here to the dock is mine, including the water." Karen squinted, then waved her hand dismissively. "Oh, those maps are so outdated. The HOA has a new agreement." "Signed by who?" "God." Her face twitched, the smile faltering just a little. "Look," she said, stepping closer. "Everyone's just trying to have a good time. Don't be that guy who ruins the fun. Then maybe you should have your fun on your own property." A few guests turned to watch, whispering like I was a zoo exhibit. One of them muttered something about territorial types. I felt the heat rise in my face but kept my tone calm. "You have 5 minutes to get everyone out before I call the sheriff." Karen gasped dramatically, hand to chest like a soap opera villain. "You wouldn't dare. I'm on the HOA board. We can fine you for harassment." I laughed. "You can try." Then I walked away, not trusting myself to stay another minute without losing my composure. By the time I got back to my cabin, the music was louder. They hadn't left. In fact, they'd brought out pool floats. I stood on my porch, watching as someone's kid peed off the dock into the water. That was the breaking point. I wasn't angry anymore. I was calculating. I didn't need to yell, argue, or call the sheriff. I had something better. See, when I bought the property, the lake had a recurring algae problem. To fix it, I'd installed a submersible pump system that circulated lake water through a filtration setup. It also had a secondary function, an aeration unit that could churn the water enough to disturb sediment and release that distinct swamp smell from the bottom. It wasn't toxic, just disgusting. I usually only ran it in winter to prevent ice buildup, but it could easily turn a serene lake into a bubbling green nightmare for anyone trying to swim. I stood there for a full minute, sipping the last of my coffee, thinking it over. Was it petty? Absolutely. But there's a difference between petty and justified, and I had no doubt which side I was on. I flipped the breaker. Within 30 seconds I heard the first scream. Then another. The pump roared to life, churning up clouds of greenish muck from the lake bed. A thick, musty odor drifted through the air, the smell of rotting vegetation mixed with something that could only be described as ancient fish burp. People started scrambling for the shore, gagging and shouting. One guy slipped, landing face-first in the newly liberated slime. A woman was shrieking about her ruined swimsuit. Karen stood frozen on the dock, her drink dangling uselessly in her hand. "What did you do?" she shouted across the water. I yelled back, "Routine maintenance." The pump gurgled louder, belching up bubbles like a boiling cauldron. Her guests were grabbing towels, shaking off bits of algae that clung to their legs. Someone yelled that their kid had swallowed some water. Karen stormed up the slope toward me, her sandals squelching. "You can't just sabotage a community event," she shouted. "Community?" I said. "You mean trespassing?" She pointed at me, trembling with fury. "You'll regret this. I'll bring this up at the next HOA meeting. You'll be fined so hard your property value will tank. Good luck with that. Just remember, if you include this little invasion in the minutes, I'll be happy to provide the sheriff's report for context." She stopped short. "You wouldn't." "I absolutely would." She glared for a few seconds, then turned sharply and stomped back to her house, muttering something about ungrateful neighbors. Her guests followed like a retreating army after losing the world's smelliest battle. By sunset, the lake was calm again, a green film settling across the surface. I sat on the dock, satisfied. It wasn't the kind of satisfaction that comes from revenge. It was the quiet relief of reclaiming your peace. I figured she'd back off after that. But of course, Karen never loses. She just regroups. The next morning, I found a letter taped to my mailbox. A formal notice from the HOA, complete with letterhead and Karen's signature at the bottom. It accused me of environmental misconduct, disturbing a community event, and creating an unsafe shared water feature. They wanted me to appear before the board. I laughed so hard I nearly dropped my coffee. But when I looked closer, I saw something that made my stomach tighten. Attached was a printed photo, taken from across the lake, showing me standing near the breaker box. Someone had filmed me. That meant Karen wasn't just angry. She was planning something. And for the first time, I wondered if I'd underestimated her. I folded the letter carefully, walked back inside, and started planning my next move. Because if Karen wanted a war over my lake, she was about to find out that calm, quiet people are the worst ones to pick a fight with. The HOA board meeting was scheduled for Saturday afternoon, but Karen didn't wait that long to start her campaign. By Wednesday, half the neighborhood was whispering about the lake incident. I could feel eyes on me every time I drove past the mailboxes or mowed the grass. A few of the less confrontational neighbors nodded awkwardly, pretending they hadn't heard Karen's version of events. Others, the type who lived for gossip and HOA drama, made no effort to hide their curiosity. It was like living inside a suburban reality show. Karen was the self-appointed producer, and I had been cast as the villain. The notice had said, mandatory appearance, which was cute considering the HOA didn't have the authority to summon anyone, but I wasn't about to let Karen narrate my story unchallenged. The night before the meeting, I went through the property documents again. Survey maps, deed copies, and even the correspondence from the environmental engineer who'd signed off on my algae pump system. I put it all in a neat folder. I wasn't nervous, just amused. I'd lived long enough to know that when someone like Karen loses control, they overplay their hand. She'd turned what could have been a minor neighborly disagreement into a full-blown power struggle. And I wasn't planning to lose. When I arrived at the community center, Karen was already holding court. She stood near the podium, surrounded by her inner circle, 3 retirees who seemed to exist solely to agree with whatever she said, and a younger couple who had moved in recently and were desperate to fit in. The room smelled faintly of lemon air freshener and coffee, the standard scent of passive-aggressive suburban diplomacy. Karen spotted me and smiled, the kind of smile politicians wear when they're about to ruin someone's life. "Oh, good you showed up," she said brightly. "We were just discussing environmental safety protocols." I gave her a nod and took a seat near the back. The meeting began with the usual nonsense. Updates about landscaping, complaints about parking violations, the eternal debate about whether the community playground needed repainting. Karen breezed through it all like a talk show host. Then she reached the final agenda item. "Now, about the situation at the lake," she said, her tone turning grave. "As you all know, there was a serious safety incident last weekend involving one of our homeowners and the community's shared natural resource." Several heads turned toward me. She continued, "Due to a misunderstanding about property lines, a mechanical system was activated during a community event, causing contamination of the water and distress among residents and guests. We'll be reviewing possible disciplinary actions and environmental assessments." I raised my hand. "You mean my pump?" Karen's eyes sparkled. "Yes, your pump. The one you turned on while people were swimming. You put families at risk." "Families who were trespassing," I said calmly. "And for the record, the lake isn't shared property. It's mine." A murmur rippled through the room. Karen gave an exaggerated sigh. "Oh, here we go again with the map. I have a community zoning diagram right here that says otherwise." She held up a laminated sheet like it was gospel. "That's a landscaping plan, not a legal boundary," I replied. "If you'd like, I can show the official county survey that proves the lake sits entirely on my parcel." The HOA treasurer, a man named Phil who usually avoided conflict, cleared his throat. "Maybe we should verify the documentation before making assumptions." Karen shot him a look sharp enough to cut drywall. "Phil, we've already verified it with the board." "You verified it with yourself," I said. "You don't have jurisdiction over private property, Karen." The room was getting tense now. People shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. The young couple looked between us like they were watching a tennis match. Karen leaned forward, lowering her voice just enough to sound menacing. "You think you're clever, don't you? Hiding behind paperwork and technicalities. But this isn't just about property lines, it's about community values. We all share responsibility for keeping our neighborhood safe and welcoming." "By trespassing?" I asked. "Because that's what your guests were doing." "They were invited guests at a community event," she snapped. "You could have just come over and asked nicely instead of turning your little science experiment into a biohazard." "I did come over and ask nicely," I said. "You told me it was a shared lake. I showed you proof it wasn't. You ignored me." I turned on the pump. Cause and effect. A few people chuckled under their breath. Karen's face flushed crimson. "This isn't funny. You could be fined thousands for environmental damage." I opened my folder, pulling out the letter from the environmental agency. Actually, this pump was installed under county supervision. It's an approved maintenance device, not a biohazard. "Want to see the permit?" Karen blinked, caught off guard. I laid the paper on the table for everyone to see. The seal was clear, the signature authentic. She tried to recover, flipping through her laminated sheets again like they might magically change. "Even so," she stammered, "you disrupted a community gathering." I smiled. "If you schedule your community gatherings on my private property again, I'll make sure to disrupt them with law enforcement next time." The room was silent for a beat. Then someone in the back, an older man with a mustache I recognized as George, who lived 2 houses down, said, "He's right. Karen, that lake isn't in the HOA boundary. I looked it up when I built my dock years ago." Karen spun around. "George, that was before the new bylaws. Bylaws don't override county property records," he said. "We told you this at the last meeting." For the first time, Karen looked uncertain. Her smile faltered. She shuffled her papers, muttering something about further review. But she couldn't let go of the fight. "Fine," she said sharply. If you're so territorial about your little lake, maybe you should take responsibility for its upkeep. The algae, the smell, people have been complaining. If it's really yours, you'll need to handle all maintenance and liability personally. The HOA won't be helping. Perfect, I said. I prefer it that way. She blinked, clearly not expecting me to agree. I stood up, gathered my folder, and added, and just so we're clear, anyone caught entering that property without permission will be reported. No warnings next time. Then I walked out, leaving the sound of murmurs and Karen's frustrated exhale behind me. That should have been the end of it. But nothing with Karen ever ends cleanly. Over the next few days I noticed strange things. My mailbox flag was bent one morning, like someone had yanked it hard. Trash appeared at the edge of my driveway, small things at first, coffee cups, beer cans, an old flip-flop. Then one morning, I found an HOA violation notice tucked under my wiper blade. Excessive outdoor noise. It cited a mechanical disturbance after hours. In other words, the algae pump. She was trying to find me again, using creative wording this time. I decided to document everything. Photos of the trash, timestamps of the pump's scheduled operation, screenshots of the weather app showing it hadn't run after 9 p.m. I even installed a small camera near the dock facing the lake. If she wanted a war of evidence, I'd play that game better than she ever could. 2 nights later, the camera paid off. I checked the footage the next morning and nearly laughed out loud. There, at 11:43 p.m., was Karen herself, wearing a hoodie and carrying a flashlight, tiptoeing along the edge of my property with what looked like a jar. She bent down near the waterline, scooped something up, and left. I had no idea what she was doing, but I was sure it wasn't innocent. That evening, I saw her SUV pull out of the driveway with her trunk slightly open, a cooler wedged inside. By the weekend, the rumor mill was buzzing again. Supposedly, the lake man had polluted the community's shared water source with illegal chemicals. Someone said there were lab results. Someone else claimed the county had been notified. It was the perfect Karen play, turn the truth into a smokescreen. But she'd made one mistake. She forgot I had her on camera trespassing while collecting her so-called evidence. I copied the footage to a USB drive, printed the time-stamped stills, and placed them neatly in an envelope. The next HOA meeting was still a week away, but I didn't need to wait that long. I had a better plan. Because if Karen wanted to make this public, I was going to let the entire neighborhood see exactly who she really was, one algae jar at a time. The morning I executed my plan, the air was unnaturally calm, like the world knew something ridiculous was about to unfold. I had spent the previous night crafting a message that balanced professionalism, sarcasm, and nuclear precision. Not an angry rant, not a defense. Just the truth, wrapped in enough evidence to turn the HOA gossip mill back on its queen. I typed it up, printed copies, and slid each one into a clear plastic sleeve. On the front of each, I taped a still image from the security footage. Karen, flashlight in hand, crouched by the lake like a swamp raccoon. I stapled them to the community bulletin board, taped them to the mailboxes, and, because poetic justice deserves stage lighting, left one right on her front door with a polite yellow sticky note that said, "For your records." The letter read simply, "To whom it may concern, on the date, HOA President Karen, last name redacted, because I'm not a monster, entered my property without permission, collected samples from my private lake, and later circulated false claims regarding chemical pollution. Attached is time-stamped visual documentation of this trespass. Property boundaries are recorded and verified with county survey maps, available on request. Any further defamation or interference will be handled through legal channels. Have a wonderful day." By noon, the neighborhood group chat was on fire. I wasn't in it, but my friend Tom down the road, who secretly despised Karen more than I did, sent me screenshots. The messages read like a slow-motion car crash of social implosion. "Karen, that footage is doctored. Melissa, but it's literally you in the picture. Bob, Why were you on his property at night? Then silence, followed by someone posting a gif of a raccoon stealing something and running away. Tom said the thread had over 200 replies before Karen locked the chat and deleted half the conversation. It was the kind of quiet, devastating victory that tasted better than coffee. But victories against people like Karen never last long. The next day, I received another HOA letter. This one was less formal. No letterhead, no printed signature, just a typed note accusing me of harassment and public defamation for distributing manipulated imagery. I laughed. She was improvising now, grasping at whatever scraps of authority she thought she had left. I ignored it. I figured she'd either cool off or move on to some new drama. But by the weekend, the real twist hit. I woke up Saturday to the sound of heavy machinery. At first, I thought a neighbor was mowing early. Then I heard the grinding sound of an auger drilling into the earth. When I stepped outside, I saw them, 3 men in neon vests unloading equipment by the lake. A small bobcat was parked near the property line, and an HOA maintenance truck was idling on the shoulder. I recognized one of the guys. He was the landscaping contractor who usually worked on the median strip near the main entrance. Karen stood beside them, clipboard in hand, giving orders like she was directing a military operation. I walked down the slope. "Morning," I said, trying to keep my voice neutral. "What exactly are you doing on my property?" Karen turned with that fake smile she used when cameras were rolling. "We're conducting environmental remediation. The county was notified about contamination, and the HOA is taking precautionary measures." "On my land?" I asked. "Without permission?" "The lake affects community drainage," she said confidently, like she'd rehearsed the line in a mirror. "Therefore, the HOA has jurisdiction under emergency conditions." "Show me the permit," I said. Her smile froze. "We don't need one. This is preventive maintenance." "Then turn the truck around before you need a lawyer," I said, stepping closer. One of the workers looked uncomfortable. He lowered his shovel. "Ma'am," he said quietly to Karen, "you didn't say this was private property." Karen's tone snapped. "It's not private, it's community accessible. Just keep working." I pulled out my phone. "I'm recording this. Anyone who keeps digging will be charged with trespassing." That got their attention. The men exchanged glances, then started packing up their tools. Karen barked at them, threatening to report them for insubordination. They ignored her. Within 5 minutes, the truck was gone, the bobcat rolling off with a hiss of gravel. She was left standing there, red-faced and sputtering. "You're unbelievable," she said. "You think you can bully everyone into doing what you want?" "Funny," I said. "I was thinking the same thing about you." She pointed at the lake, her hand shaking. "You don't understand what you've done. That pump is illegal. It violates runoff regulations. It's county-approved. Want me to call the inspector who signed off on it?" She hesitated, realizing she'd already tried that bluff before. "This isn't over," she muttered, turning on her heel and storming off toward her SUV. When she left, I noticed something strange on the ground near the water, an open jar half buried in the mud. The same kind of jar she'd been carrying in the footage. I picked it up carefully. Inside was green water, thick with algae. But mixed in were clumps of something else. Foam, maybe detergent or fertilizer runoff. My gut told me she'd been trying to seed the lake with something nasty to prove her contamination theory. If I hadn't caught her early, she might have dumped enough to cause an actual bloom. That night, I decided it was time to get ahead of her. I contacted the county environmental department myself and filed a report. I explained the situation calmly, provided copies of my permits, and attached the footage of Karen trespassing. The inspector, a woman named Janet, called me back within hours. She sounded half amused, half annoyed. "We've had reports from your HOA about contamination," she said. "But the sample they submitted doesn't match the natural algae profile of your lake. We're pretty sure someone tampered with it." "So it's fabricated," I said. Looks that way. We'll need to visit in person, though. I'll come by Monday morning. I thanked her and hung up, grinning. Karen had tried to bury me with lies, but she'd just handed me her shovel. When Monday came, Janet arrived with her county badge, a clipboard, and a pair of waders. Karen appeared 10 minutes later, marching down the slope like she owned the place. "Good morning," she said too sweetly. "Glad to see you taking this seriously." Janet gave her a polite nod. "You're the HOA representative?" "Yes," Karen said proudly. "We're deeply concerned about the environmental impact of this unregulated system." Janet raised an eyebrow. "Unregulated? The same system my department approved 2 years ago?" Karen blinked. "Excuse me." Janet pulled out the file I'd emailed. "This is the permit. Signed by me, actually." Karen's mouth opened, then closed. "There must be a mistake. The community map shows this as shared jurisdiction." "It doesn't," Janet said, matter of fact. "This lake is fully within his private parcel. The HOA has no claim." Karen tried to pivot. "Well, regardless, there's been contamination. We have lab results." "I've seen them," Janet replied. "The sample you submitted came from a jar containing traces of detergent and synthetic phosphate. That's not lake algae. It's household cleaning runoff. Can you explain that?" The silence that followed was glorious. Karen's expression shifted from defiance to panic to indignation, all within 5 seconds. I don't know. Someone must have tampered with the sample." Janet smiled tightly. "You're welcome to file an appeal, but given the trespassing footage and the chemical mismatch, I'd advise against doubling down." Karen turned toward me, her voice trembling with forced composure. "You think you've won, don't you? You think making me look foolish changes anything?" "I don't need to make you look foolish," I said. "You're handling that yourself." Janet couldn't hide her smirk. She packed up her notes, thanked me for my cooperation, and promised to file a full report confirming there was no contamination. Karen stood frozen for a long moment before finally storming back up the slope, muttering something about neighbors with too much time. I watched her go, feeling a mix of victory and dread. Because while I'd cleared my name, I knew Karen wasn't the type to accept defeat. She'd twist, deflect, and find some new way to strike back. That night, as the moonlight shimmered over the lake's calm surface, I caught a flicker of movement near the far side, a reflection of headlights stopping briefly before driving off. Maybe just someone turning around. Or maybe Karen plotting her next brilliant disaster. Either way, I decided to leave the pump running on a timer from now on. Because if she wanted to keep playing games, I'd be ready. And this time, the lake itself might just help me fight back. By Tuesday morning, the lake had returned to its natural calm, but the neighborhood hadn't. Karen had gone unusually silent since her humiliating showdown with the county inspector, and that silence was worse than her usual yelling. People like her didn't retreat, they regrouped. It's what made them dangerous. I spent the week half expecting her to file another complaint, stage another meeting, or start another rumor. But nothing happened. Not a letter, not a peep. Even the usual HOA flyers that magically appeared in everyone's mailboxes stopped coming. It was eerie, the kind of calm you only get before a storm or a really stupid plan. The first sign came Thursday afternoon. I was working on my deck when I noticed a large pile of fresh gravel dumped right at the border between our properties. At first, I thought it was just roadwork, but then I saw the small orange flags marking the edge of the slope, my side of the slope. The pile stretched right into my yard, and a white post had been hammered into the ground with a laminated sign that read, "Future Site, Community Access Path." My heart sank, then boiled. She wasn't even pretending anymore. This was open war. I grabbed my phone and called the HOA number listed on the letterhead from her earlier notices. A bored-sounding secretary answered. "Homeowners Association, how can I help you?" "This is about the gravel dumped behind Lot 27, I said. "Who authorized that?" That would be the new Community Improvement Initiative," she said, clicking her keyboard. A shared access walkway to the lake. There's no shared lake, I said. And no one approved that on my property. Karen did, she said like it was obvious. She's the project coordinator. She said you agreed verbally. I laughed so hard I nearly dropped the phone. Yeah, that's not true. Remove it or I'm billing the HOA for trespass and cleanup. She hesitated, then lowered her voice. You'll need to take that up at the next meeting, sir. I'll take it up with a lawyer, I said and hung up. That evening, I set up another camera facing the gravel pile. I didn't trust anyone. Sure enough, at sunset, Karen showed up again, wearing that ridiculous sun hat and carrying a clipboard like it made her legitimate. With her were two teenage boys I assumed were her nephews, or maybe bribed volunteers. They started spreading the gravel with rakes, carving a path down toward the lake. I walked over calmly, camera in hand, recording the whole thing. Evening, Karen, I said. Making yourself at home? She didn't even turn around. I told you this is a community project, she said. The HOA approved it. Funny, because the county zoning office didn't. Want me to call them? She straightened up and faced me. You're obsessed with paperwork. This is about community, not bureaucracy. This is about you being unable to accept the word no, I said. And just to remind you, you're trespassing again. She smirked. Then call the police. I'll tell them you assaulted minors on your property. How do you think that'll look when the HOA hears about it? It took everything in me not to laugh in her face. Nice try, but the camera's been recording since you arrived. You're the only one committing a crime here. Her smirk faltered just a bit. You can't stop progress, she said, tossing her rake onto the gravel. This path will exist whether you like it or not. We'll see about that, I said quietly. When she finally left, I called the sheriff's office. Not the emergency line, just the local enforcement desk. I explained the situation, sent over the footage, and asked for an official property trespass notice to be issued. The deputy on duty was polite, even amused. Let me guess, he said. HOA trouble? You have no idea, I replied. He promised to send someone by the next morning to verify the property line and issue the warning. True to his word, Deputy Harris arrived at 9 sharp. He was a solid man with a kind smile and the patience of someone who had seen way too many suburban feuds. So, he said, looking out at the gravel path, that's the famous lake. Famous? I asked. He chuckled. We've had 3 calls from this area in 2 months. All from your HOA president. That checks out, I said. He examined my survey markers, nodded approvingly, then walked the slope with his GPS. You're clean, he said. Everything past this stake is yours. She's in the wrong. He filled out the paperwork, gave me a copy, and promised he'd deliver the official warning to her personally. Might want to expect fireworks, he added with a grin. Sure enough, fireworks came, just not the kind I expected. That evening, as the sun dipped low, I heard shouting across the lake. It wasn't Karen this time but her teenage recruits, arguing with someone else. I walked down to the dock and saw them on the far side, near her yard, waving their arms and kicking something into the water. When they spotted me, they scattered, running toward her house. A moment later, I saw why. Floating in the water near my dock were dozens of small, shredded paper bits. I fished a few out and realized what they were. Copies of my permit and property documents. She had stolen them from the bulletin board and torn them up, probably thinking it would erase my leverage. That was the moment I stopped reacting. Up until then, I'd been playing defense, responding to her every stunt. But she wasn't just trying to control the neighborhood, she was trying to break the narrative. To make me the problem. That night, I decided to shift gears entirely. I wasn't just going to defend my property anymore. I was going to expose her once and for all. The opportunity came faster than I expected. The following week, the HOA announced their annual summer community barbecue. It was Karen's pride and joy, a mandatory event where attendance was strongly encouraged. She'd rented a catering tent, ordered matching banners, and even arranged a dunk tank sponsored by the HOA. The flyer landed in my mailbox like an invitation to war. And then I noticed one particular line in the fine print. Venue, Community Lakefront. I almost laughed out loud. She was planning to hold her party, again, on my lake. So I made preparations. I didn't confront her, didn't send letters, didn't even acknowledge the flyer. Instead, I spent the next few evenings quietly rigging the dock's pump system for a little theatrical performance. The aerator system had 3 separate circuits, one for surface churning, one for deep agitation, and one for algae control. When all 3 were activated in sequence, the water didn't just bubble, it frothed into a greenish, foamy mess that smelled faintly like a mix between seaweed and old socks. Not harmful, just spectacularly unpleasant. Saturday arrived, sunny and obnoxiously cheerful. By noon, Karen's guests were pouring in. SUVs lined the street, kids ran across lawns, and Karen herself was floating around in a bright pink dress that screamed, "Attention." I sat on my porch, camera ready, sipping lemonade like a man about to watch a slow-motion masterpiece. Music started blasting. People carried plates of barbecue down to the dock, setting up lawn chairs. Someone even dragged a portable speaker to the water's edge. Karen took the microphone and shouted something about celebrating community unity. Then, as the first few brave souls jumped into the water, I flipped the breaker from inside my cabin. The lake erupted. The pump system kicked into overdrive, churning the water until it foamed like a cauldron. Within seconds, the entire surface turned a sickly green. The smell hit next, thick, wet, and unmistakable. Guests started gagging and screaming. A woman dropped her plate of food into the grass. Kids scrambled out of the water, coated in slimy residue. Someone yelled, "Is this toxic?" Karen froze mid-speech, microphone still in hand, as the chaos unfolded around her. I waited until she locked eyes with me across the yard. Then I raised my glass in a slow, deliberate toast. Her face turned the color of overripe tomatoes. She stomped toward me, slipping in the mud on the way. "You're insane," she shouted. "You've ruined everything." I kept my tone calm. "It's maintenance day. Didn't you get the memo? You planned this. Just like you planned a party on my property?" Her guests were already leaving, coughing and waving their hands in front of their faces. One shouted, "Karen, this is disgusting. Why didn't you tell us it wasn't clean?" Another yelled, "My kid was swimming in that." The crowd quickly turned against her, and by the time she reached my fence, the party had completely dissolved into a parade of honking cars and angry muttering. She glared at me, shaking with rage. "This isn't over," she said, her voice trembling. I smiled slightly. "You said that last time." She stormed off without another word, her shoes squelching in the muck. That night the air was silent again. The lake, though temporarily green, looked oddly serene under the moonlight. I sat on the dock, watching the ripples fade, thinking about how far this ridiculous feud had gone. It should have ended there. But as I'd soon learn, Karen's definition of not over involved one last, spectacularly unhinged act of revenge, one that would make every previous stunt look like child's play. The following week began deceptively quiet, the kind of silence that made you question if you were imagining things. The lake was still tinted green from the foam storm I'd unleashed during Karen's disastrous HOA barbecue, but by midweek, the water had cleared enough that ducks returned, as if declaring it habitable again. Neighbors had started to treat me differently, some with newfound respect, others with wary politeness. It was like they couldn't decide if I was a hero for standing up to Karen or a ticking time bomb waiting for his next explosion. Karen, meanwhile, had gone completely off the radar. No HOA emails, no flyers, no social media updates. Her house looked dark at night, blinds drawn, driveway empty. I knew she was planning something, though. She wasn't the type to lick her wounds quietly. She was the type to come back swinging, usually with paperwork or a new interpretation of community bylaws. It was Friday morning when the next shot landed. A courier knocked on my door and handed me a large envelope marked Legal Notice. I opened it expecting another HOA complaint, but this time it wasn't from the association. It was from a law firm. Inside was a formal letter accusing me of environmental sabotage, defamation, and intentional emotional distress. The listed plaintiff, Karen herself. The kicker was the attached demand for damages: $20,000 for property devaluation, public embarrassment, and therapy costs resulting from sustained harassment. I actually laughed out loud. It was so absurd it felt like a parody. Still, it was serious enough that I needed to respond properly. I called my lawyer, an old friend named Greg who specialized in property dispute. When I finished explaining, he let out a long sigh. "She's bluffing," he said. "She's trying to scare you into settling or retracting something. But we'll handle it. Just don't engage directly." I agreed, though the advice was easier said than done. Every time I walked outside and saw the lake, I thought about that lawsuit sitting on my counter like a loaded trap. Then Saturday night came, and the situation turned from ridiculous to dangerous. Around 11, I heard the unmistakable whir of an engine near the waterline. Not a car, something smaller like a generator or a pump. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped onto the porch. The glow of headlights flickered through the trees, followed by the splash of water being disturbed. My gut clenched. I moved down the slope quietly, and that's when I saw it. Karen, dressed in dark clothes, crouched near the lake with a small motorized pump connected to a plastic barrel. "What the hell are you doing?" I shouted, startling her. She jumped back, losing her balance and slipping into the mud. The pump kept whirring, and a thick liquid, oily, dark, and foul-smelling, was spilling from the barrel straight into the water. I lunged forward and shut it off, choking on the stench. Karen scrambled up, face wild and pale in the flashlight beam. "This is your fault," she screamed. "You poisoned it first. I'm just proving it's contaminated." "By actually contaminating it?" I yelled back. "Are you insane?" She froze for half a second, then bolted toward her SUV parked up the slope. I took a photo of the barrel, the hose, everything, before she peeled off down the road. My hands were shaking, partly from rage, partly from the realization that she'd finally crossed a line she couldn't talk her way out of. I called the sheriff immediately. Deputy Harris arrived 20 minutes later, sleepy but sharp. He took one look at the scene and whistled. "Well, this just went from HOA drama to environmental crime," he said. "We filed the report right there." I handed him the photos and explained everything, from the lawsuit to the pump system to her nighttime sabotage attempt. Harris promised to forward the evidence to the county environmental unit. "If that barrel contains anything hazardous," he said, "she's in serious trouble." The next day, 2 county trucks showed up. The inspectors took samples, documented the residue, and confirmed my suspicion. It was liquid fertilizer mixed with soap concentrate. Enough to trigger a temporary algae bloom, but not enough to cause long-term harm. Intentional contamination, they called it. That night, I sat on my deck, thinking about how someone could twist themselves so completely with pride and vengeance that they'd risk poisoning a lake just to make a point. Karen's madness wasn't about the water anymore. It was about control, about proving she could still make me react. By Monday, the sheriff's office officially opened a case. I didn't even have to press charges. They did it themselves, citing malicious trespass and environmental tampering. Karen was served that afternoon. According to Tom, who happened to be walking his dog when it happened, she tried to argue with the deputy for nearly 20 minutes before finally retreating inside and slamming the door. Word spread fast. By evening, half the neighborhood knew. Some people were sympathetic. "She's been under a lot of stress," one woman said. Others were gleeful. "About time someone called her out," another neighbor muttered. For once, I wasn't the villain in her story. But Karen wasn't finished. The next day, I woke up to find my mailbox ripped clean off its post. Just gone. Like someone had taken a crowbar to it. A childish move, but I wasn't surprised. I replaced it immediately, this time with a heavy steel locking box. Then I installed 2 more cameras, one facing the road, one pointing toward her property line. If she wanted a surveillance war, I'd win that too. On Wednesday, something unexpected happened. A new HOA email arrived, but this time, it wasn't from Karen. It was from the vice president, Phil, the same guy she'd talked over during that early meeting. His message was short and formal. Effective immediately, Karen, last name, has been placed on administrative leave pending investigation. Interim leadership will be assumed by the remaining board members. I reread it 3 times, just to make sure I wasn't imagining it. Karen had finally been suspended. She wasn't just losing face, she was losing her throne. I went out to the dock that afternoon, the air light with the sound of frogs and wind. For the first time in months, I felt peace settling back into the lake. The reflection of the sky shimmered like nothing had ever happened. It would have been poetic if it ended there, but life never gives you clean endings. Around dusk, I noticed a faint orange glow flickering behind Karen's house. At first, I thought it was her porch light, but then the glow pulsed brighter. I grabbed my binoculars. What I saw made my blood run cold, smoke rising from the brush pile near her fence. It wasn't a full fire yet, but the wind was pushing the flames dangerously close to the dry grass leading toward the lake. I sprinted down the hill, grabbed my garden hose, and ran toward the blaze, yelling her name. She didn't answer. The flames were small but spreading fast. I sprayed the edge furiously, creating a wet barrier. After a few minutes, I managed to smother it. My hands were shaking, and my shirt was soaked, but the fire was out. Then I saw her. She was standing just beyond the smoke, watching me silently. Her face was half lit by the dying flames, eyes hollow and unrecognizable. "What did you do?" I shouted. She didn't move. "You ruined me," she said in a low, shaking voice. "They've taken everything. You humiliated me." "You did that yourself," I said, breathing hard. "You started all of this." She stepped forward, the flicker of anger rising again. "You think you won, but you don't understand how this works. People like me always come back." I stared at her for a long moment. "Not this time," I said quietly. "You've burned every bridge, literally." Before she could answer, a sheriff's cruiser pulled up, lights flashing. Deputy Harris stepped out, took one look at the smoldering grass, and shook his head. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to step back." Karen froze. For a moment, it looked like she might argue, but then something inside her just broke. She sank onto the ground, hands over her face. Harris radioed in for the fire department, who arrived minutes later to ensure the blaze was fully contained. They confirmed it hadn't spread beyond her fence, but the report alone was enough. Harris turned to me afterward. "You okay?" "Yeah," I said, though my voice was tight. "Just tired of this circus." He nodded. "We'll file this under reckless endangerment. Might finally stick this time." I looked over at Karen as they spoke to her quietly. She wasn't screaming anymore, just sitting there, staring at the water. The same lake she'd tried to claim, poison, and now nearly burn around. It struck me how strange it was, how power, ego, and a few feet of property line could unravel a person's entire sense of reason. By midnight, the sirens were gone, and the only sound was the soft hum of the aerator pump. I sat on the dock, staring out over the rippling surface. The air smelled faintly of smoke and algae, a reminder of everything that had happened. I thought about how this feud had started, with a few trespassing swimmers, and how it had spiraled into lawsuits, contamination, and fire. It wasn't funny anymore, it was tragic. But deep down, I knew one thing for certain: Karen's downfall wasn't an accident. It was inevitable. You can only fight the world for so long before it stops fighting back and just watches you destroy yourself. And as much as I hated her for everything she'd done, I couldn't help but feel a flicker of pity. Because tomorrow, when the HOA officially removed her, She'd realized that her war over control had cost her the one thing she couldn't stand to lose: control itself. When morning came, the air was strangely still, heavy with the smell of damp earth and burnt wood. The blackened patch of grass near Karen's fence looked almost ceremonial, a perfect circle of destruction marking the end of something ugly. The sheriff's warning tape fluttered faintly in the breeze, a quiet reminder of how far things had gone. For the first time in months, I didn't hear Karen's voice echoing across the water. No barking orders, no accusations, no hollow justifications about community property. Just silence. I brewed coffee and sat on the dock, watching sunlight shimmer across the lake's surface. It was peaceful, but the kind of peace that comes after a storm, the eerie kind that feels too fragile to trust. Around 9, a white SUV with county plates rolled up. Deputy Harris stepped out alongside a man in a navy suit carrying a briefcase. "Morning," Harris said, waving. "Hope you don't mind us dropping by. This here's Mr. Dunn from the county attorney's office." I stood to greet them, and Dunn got right to the point. "We're closing out the investigation," he said. "Thought you'd want an update." He explained that the county had reviewed all the footage, reports, and contamination samples. Karen was officially being charged with trespassing, falsifying environmental claims, and reckless endangerment. The fire incident was the tipping point. "She's looking at fines and mandatory community service," Dunn said. "No jail time, but a hefty penalty." I nodded. "And the HOA?" Harris grinned. "Phil sent in a full resignation letter from her yesterday. She's out permanently. The board's electing new leadership next week." It should have felt like victory, but it didn't. I thanked them both, shook their hands, and watched the SUV roll away. The lake looked almost too calm, the reflection perfect and undisturbed. For months it had been the battleground for a war I hadn't wanted, and now that it was over, I wasn't sure what to do with the quiet. Later that afternoon, Tom stopped by, carrying a bag of groceries and his usual sarcastic smirk. "Thought you might need supplies," he said. "Victory Provisions." He set the bag down on my counter: coffee, snacks, and a six-pack of beer. "Whole neighborhood's talking," he added. "Half of them say you're a legend. The other half think you're the devil. Either way, you're famous." I laughed. "Not exactly the kind of reputation I wanted." He shrugged. "You embarrassed the queen of the HOA on her own battlefield. People will be telling that story for years." We sat on the porch, sipping beer while dragonflies skimmed over the water. The air was warm, but the breeze carried the faint scent of algae and ash. Tom glanced toward Karen's house. "You think she'll move?" I took a long sip before answering. "People like her don't move. They just rebuild somewhere else." He nodded thoughtfully. "Still, you won." "Did I?" I said quietly. "I spent half a year fighting someone who couldn't admit she was wrong. I lost sleep, sanity, and peace of mind over a lake." "Yeah, but it's your lake," he said with a grin. "And it's still standing." That night, after Tom left, I walked down to the dock again. The moon was high, casting a silver path across the water. The pump hummed softly in the background, steady and reassuring. I found myself thinking about how it had all started. The first day I'd seen her guests swimming here, how harmless it had seemed before it spiraled. I wondered if, at any point, either of us could have stopped it before it reached the point of police tape and lawsuit. Maybe if I'd just let it go. Maybe if she'd backed off. But the truth was, Karen couldn't live without control, and I couldn't live under someone else's thumb. It was bound to explode. A faint crunch of gravel made me look up. Someone was walking toward me along the path. My pulse spiked until I recognized the figure. Phil, the interim HOA president. He raised a hand in greeting. "Evening," he said, stopping at the edge of the dock. "Hope I'm not intruding." "Not at all," I said, motioning to the empty chair beside me. He sat down, resting his hands on his knees. "I wanted to apologize," he said after a moment, "for not stepping in sooner. We all knew Karen was difficult. but nobody wanted to be the one to stand up to her. You did what the rest of us were too cowardly to do. I didn't do it for anyone else, I said. I just wanted her to stop. He nodded. Still, it mattered. People feel like they can breathe again. We're rewriting the bylaws, stripping out all that nonsense she added about shared access and community enforcement. We're even voting to make your property officially excluded from HOA jurisdiction. That caught me off guard. Wait, seriously? He smiled. Seriously. You'll be free of us for good. No more fines, no more meetings, no more Karen. For the first time in months, I felt something close to relief. Real, genuine relief. I appreciate that, I said. Phil stood and looked out over the water. You know, she called me this morning, he said quietly. Before we sent the removal notice. She said she was leaving town for a while. Didn't say where. Just that she needed to get away from toxic people. I couldn't help but chuckle. The irony is impressive. He smiled faintly. If it's any comfort, I don't think she'll be back. He left soon after, and I stayed out there for a long while, watching the reflection of the stars ripple gently across the surface. It felt strange to realize it was finally over. No more confrontations, no more schemes. Just still water and the quiet hum of the pump that had caused so much chaos. A week later, I attended the HOA election meeting out of curiosity. It was surreal walking into the same community hall where, not long ago, Karen had stood at the podium waving her laminated map. This time, the atmosphere was calm, even friendly. Phil was officially voted in as president, and several neighbors approached me afterward, shaking my hand, thanking me for setting things right. I smiled politely but kept my responses short. The truth was, I wasn't interested in being a hero. I just wanted to go home and forget all of it. On the drive back, I passed Karen's house. It was empty now, windows dark, yard overgrown, a for sale sign staked into the ground. For a moment, I felt something unexpected. Not triumph, not satisfaction, but sadness. Whatever else she'd been, arrogant, manipulative, destructive, she was also human. Somewhere under all that fury had been a person who desperately needed control because without it, she had nothing. And when she lost that control, she crumbled. 2 weeks later, I woke up to the sound of rain on the roof. The lake shimmered through the mist, perfectly calm again. I poured myself coffee and stood at the window, watching the ripples spread out like quiet echoes of everything that had happened. The property felt alive again, peaceful, grounded, mine. I'd thought I'd feel victorious, but what I really felt was clarity. The whole feud had been ridiculous from the start, two stubborn people locked in a tug-of-war over pride. She'd been fighting for control. I'd been fighting for peace. Maybe we both lost something along the way. That afternoon, I walked around the perimeter of the lake, checking the fences and property markers. Everything was intact. The grass had started to regrow near the charred patch where the fire had been. Ducks floated lazily near the dock, unconcerned with human nonsense. I sat down on the edge, dangling my feet in the cool water. For the first time since this madness began, the lake didn't feel like a battlefield anymore. It felt like what it was always meant to be, quiet, steady, indifferent to the chaos around it. Then, as if fate wanted to end the story with a wink, a soft breeze blew through the trees, carrying something fluttering across the water. A torn piece of paper drifted near my foot. I picked it up and realized it was part of an old HOA notice, one of Karen's, faded and soggy. The ink was barely visible, but one line still stood out, maintaining harmony through shared responsibility. I couldn't help but laugh. It was almost poetic, the last trace of her nonsense dissolving in the very lake she'd tried to conquer. I let the paper fall back into the water and watched it sink slowly beneath the surface. Then I stood, took a deep breath, and turned off the pump. The lake no longer needed defending. Neither did I. That night, as the crickets sang and moonlight danced across the calm water, I realized something important. Every person has their own version of peace, and sometimes protecting it means standing your ground, even when it feels absurd, even when the fight seems petty. Because peace doesn't come from avoiding conflict, it comes from ending it on your own terms. And as I sat there on the dock for the last time that summer, the air cool and still, I finally felt it, quiet, complete, and entirely my own.